Ni hao. Um, I'm grateful to have been invited to this conference, to have the chance to meet and so many new colleagues and to hear their ideas, and also to have had the chance to go to the Foguang over the weekend, which was a very, very special trip. Our conference organizers have posed a very intriguing question when they ask, what did Liang Sicheng miss at Mount Wutai? And they offer a partial answer. They said, they mentioned the unexpected discovery of what Liang Sicheng missed, the strange intertwining and disconnect of traditional and vernacular architecture at Mount Wutai. I would add why they missed to that. As I approach my particular and I think very daunting task to examine the question of the vernacular. At this point, I think it's fair to assume that everyone in the room has his or her own working definition of the term vernacular. What am I doing? Whoops. Thank you. But it's a word whose meaning has expanded and shifted considerably over the past half century in particular, from a sense that the vernacular is the architecture of the pre-industrial and often isolated communities. Sometimes it's described in that respect as a primitive architecture, to the sense that it's an architecture that grows out of local conditions and inherited social practices. In that sense, often called a folk architecture or traditional architecture, and generally opposed to popular architecture that grows out of the commercial economy of larger societies. Added to this is the common and mostly erroneous assumption that what's called vernacular architecture is owner-built without the professional services of builders or even architects, to a sense that it's something, it's whatever lies outside the narrow traditions of high or elite architecture as defined by cultural authorities, including, and that would include everything from suburban houses to fast food restaurants, and this seems to me to be the least objectionable way to put it, that it's simply the ordinary aspects of the built environment as opposed to its extraordinary aspects. It's important to remember that 100 years ago in Euro-America, the word vernacular was almost unknown as applied to architecture. What we now call vernacular was seen as non-architecture. It was the province of antiquarians and relic hunters. By the middle of the 20th century, it had been transformed into, to use the title of two very famous books, Native Genius in Anonymous Architecture, or Architecture Without Architects. It was an from this point of view, it was an architecture that seemed to adhere intuitively to the principles that modernist architecture strove so actively to promote. Since that time, scholars have come to understand that buildings outside of high or official architecture have stories and histories of their own. So the paradoxical effect of this is to reify the distinction between high architecture and not high architecture. It gives those of my architectural history colleagues who prefer the traditional art historical canon of architecture an excuse to continue to ignore the excluded. They say, yes, it's architecture, but it's not my field. So I try not to use the word vernacular because it gives architectural historians an excuse for narrowness and intellectual laziness, but also because it reifies categories that can't withstand examination, scrutiny. That is, I don't use it because whichever way we define vernacular, our definitions are laden with often unexamined assumptions that I think hinder us in our attempt to understand the human-made environment, whether you want to call it the built environment, the cultural landscape, and they obscure the historical processes that form the built environment as we encounter it in the field. What I'd like to do then is to examine some of these ways of thinking about the vernacular as a way to understand how the work of Liang and his colleagues at Mount Wutai and elsewhere relate to some fundamental questions about the nature of architecture of any kind. Questions such as who creates architecture and how do they do so? Why do they build what they do? Where do their ideas come from? How does architecture change? Let's begin by placing ourselves on an imaginary island where we are confronted with a host of unfamiliar buildings. They're all different, but they all seem to have some commonalities. Fortunately, the archaeologist James Ford invented this island for us 60 years ago. We might add, for realism, a few temples, palaces, sports stadiums, gas stations, McDonald's. How do we begin to understand this mix? Is there an order to them? Well, we could sort them geographically, finding that certain forms tended to cluster in certain places with some overlaps. And that's the underlying assumption behind much of what has historically been called vernacular architecture, that it is figuratively insular. We assume that what ties them together are the values of a little community, to borrow a phrase from another anthropologist working at the same time that Ford worked. If we did that, we might want to count the frequency of certain manifestations as a marker of which values, which choices are more central and which are more peripheral. And that's what's going on in the drawing on the right, our original drawing, that the most common kinds of houses are in the middle, and as you move out toward the edges, houses are least common. Or we could sort them chronologically. Both of these strategies involve looking for formal similarities. It's not different in any way from the way architectural historians formerly used visual and stylistic continuities to make the same kinds of distinctions as in Bannister Fletcher's notorious tree of architecture from the early 20th century. If we sort things geographically, we assume some sort of insularity. If we sort them by frequency distribution, we assume variation within a stable tradition. If we sort them chronologically, we assume that the most important aspect is change. But the question is, how does change happen? As Wim Allen has shown in her dissertation, Liang, like many scholars of his generation, was deeply influenced by cultural evolutionary thought. This is a thought that assumed that material culture, including architecture, mirrored the progressive complexity and sophistication of entire cultures. And this assumption wasn't unique to him. If you look at other people working in so-called traditional architecture at the same time, the same kinds of evolutionary attempts to show evolutionary development are there. Whenever we use that evolutionary paradigm, we imply, even when we disavow it, we imply some sort of genetic connection between that ensures continuity, even when it doesn't. This image on the left by Norman Isham and Albert Brown, this is from the first vernacular architecture book in the U.S., trying to show the evolution of houses in a small state, Rhode Island. But you can see along the left side that there are some houses that just can't be fit into that nice progression that goes through A, B, E, F, and so on. Common explanations in Western historiography emphasize social or craft development in terms of the small community. That is, emphasize what we would call tradition. As an example, Cecil Hewitt, who was a scholar of English carpentry, who believed that you studied the history of carpentry by studying the history of carpentry joints. Hewitt argued that carpentry joints evolved out of the craft pride of carpenters, that they were always trying to improve their joints, always changing them to try to make them even better than they were. But, he says, when they finally achieved perfection, the carpenters didn't realize it. So they kept tinkering with them so that joints began to get worse and worse as carpenters passed the point of perfection, resulting in a decline in the quality of carpentry after the High Middle Ages. On the other hand, Henry Glassy, who is an American folklorist, used ideas from generative grammar, a school of linguistics, to imply without directly saying so, part of his strategy was not to be open about this, that architectural abilities were something like linguistic competence, and that they were. By doing this, he grafted his argument onto the argument of linguists that language is a special capacity of the human brain. So he was suggesting that somehow architectural design was similar to human language in being somehow hardwired into the brain. In that case, change happened as a result of the operations of individual imagination within the tradition that people had learned. And I'm fumbling here because I have misplaced a page. But anyway, in addition to those two ways of looking at things, we could look at things the way that art historians do, and that is that change happens as a result of of individual genius working within a particular school or tradition. An explicitly articulated canon, aesthetic canon. This is an image from Roxanne Williamson's book, American Architects and the Mechanics of Fame, and what the image is meant to imply is the personal connections of influence among all famous American architects, from the very first one, Benjamin Latrobe in the late 18th century, to the architects of the 20th century. So that for her, change in architecture happens as a result of the instruction by a previous generation and the individual imagination, individual genius of the tutee. Structures of that sort, structures that fall within an explicitly articulated canon of that sort, traditionally are seen as high architecture, or more invidiously as true architecture. Everything else, what we sometimes call vernacular architecture, is mere building. And by implication, you've heard that distinction from Nicholas Pevsner, architecture versus mere building, Durham Cathedral versus a bicycle shed. That's actually a comparison that goes back to the 19th century. But by implication, this architecture outside that canon is ahistorical. But in any case, whether we take any of these strategies, we're looking for commonalities among apparent difference. We're looking for similarities. Whereas for art historians in this scheme, we're looking for difference among apparent similarities. So let's turn to Liang Sicheng and the work of the Society for Research in Chinese Architecture. We can think of them as people setting off for this imaginary island that we looked at a few minutes ago, trying to sort out their island. Perhaps the hardest task in architectural history, as I'm sure in many other fields, is to make sense of something that no one has ever worked on. If you have predecessors, however bad or wrong-headed they might be, you at least have a starting point, an entry point. If you're faced with a sea of that island that no one's ever thought about, it's very difficult to do. So we might ask, what to invert the question that Lo and Rujivasharku asked, what did Liang and the Society not miss, and why did they not? And I should say that my knowledge of Liang's work comes from his only book in English, Pictorial History of Chinese Architecture, and from the works translated by Vimalan and Deyin in the book that's at the core of this conference, and Vimalan's own very brilliant dissertation that traces the intellectual history of Chinese architectural history in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So my knowledge, what I say substantively about Liang comes from those sources. But nevertheless, when I look at that work, I see what seems to me a very familiar approach to the history of architecture. And I've copied out on the bottom the inscription of the drawing because it offers clues to the context in which Liang was working and can help us understand his goals. It identifies the structure as the main hall. of what was once an important monastery at a major pilgrimage site in Shanxi. And those simple qualities make it, to his mind, a significant building. It identifies the structure as having been built in 857 AD, as having been built during the Tang Dynasty. It tells us that this is, as far as he knew at the time the drawing was made, the oldest surviving wooden structure in China. It emphasizes the section of the building, and hence it emphasizes its timber framing, its structure. As you all know, Liang was educated in architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, and then spent some time at Harvard after that. At the time he attended Penn's architecture school, it was heavily under the influence of the educational system of the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And that was a very explicitly articulated kind of system. One of the lesser studied aspects of that system was the emphasis on the production of restoration drawings of ancient monuments. That's a practice. Here's Theodore Labrousse restoration of a temple at Cora, made as part of his Rome Prize years. That practice, in turn, can be traced back to the 18th century, to architects and antiquarians who began to measure the ruins of classical antiquity and to present those ruins in publications. 2 points to make about that tradition, that practice, that are relevant to what we're looking at today. One is that it was the part of a project of the fledgling architectural profession in Europe and North America to define a scientific, and by that I mean systematic, orderly basis of professional knowledge. And to architects in the 19th century, that professional knowledge was based in architectural history. Architectural history was the architect's birthright. It was his, since almost all architects were he's at that time, his claim to professional authority is to command this legacy. And what that meant was that this gave primacy to the empirical physical qualities of the building as a material object. At first looking primarily at the visual qualities of the building, and second, later on, at the structural qualities. The second thing that this did was to emphasize understanding buildings at the moment of their creation. And then their visual in images, and later physical restoration. So looking at these antique ruins, the thing you want to do is to know how it looked when it was first built. This is an image from Stewart and Rivette's multi-volume work, The Antiquities of Athens, in which they drew the surviving monuments. They gave you images of the monument as it existed today, and they gave you images like the one on the right of the monument as they thought it had been when it was first built. The second thing is that, that was it. And what that had to do, was the tendency to do was to isolate individual buildings from their own histories, to overlook, downplay, lament the changes that occurred over the life of the building. It also points to an underlying primitivist assumption that still runs through much of vernacular architecture studies, that the earliest, least developed form of anything is purer, is superior to what comes after. But one corollary we might propose in opposition to that is that no building is important to a society. No building that is important to any society escapes change. To put it another way, if you find a building that hasn't been changed, it means that no one cared about it. It wasn't worth the trouble. So if we go back to Liang's drawing of the Dafodian, we understand why he labeled this the oldest wooden building in China, why he was interested in it. Primitivism, an element of exoticism, as Professor Pan mentioned yesterday. A big part of the fascination is simply how old it was. We understand his use of the date form AD. which is obviously a coinage of the Christian West. Like the form of the drawing itself, it pointed to his roots in the roots of this kind of investigation in Liang's architectural education in the United States and ultimately in the architectural researches of Europe in the 18th and 19th century. But Liang also noted that the hall was built in the Tang Dynasty. So he located it within a Chinese chronology as well as in a Western chronology. As Vimalan has shown, Liang was heavily influenced by the Japanese architect Ito Chuta, who wanted to place European and Asian architecture on an equal footing by defining them as twin shoots of a route located somewhere in Anatolia. When we walk into the lobby of the architecture school in Tsinghua, this is very eloquently, point is very eloquently made visually by the Western classical Ionic order at one end of the lobby and what Liang called the Chinese order at the other end of the lobby. And I'll have more to say about that point, but and I'll come back to it. But right now I want to return to the first point, the idea of the focus on the building as the subject of study, the building itself. Inherent in this method is the idea that the physical form is the key element, whether we're talking about the visual form, the spatial form, the structural form, that what we're trying to do is to define a typology, of a set of morphologies of buildings. If we think back to Ford's Island and our ways that we might sort them chronologically, geographically, and the assumptions behind those sortings, that is setting a cultural with a small c traditional way of looking at things versus an individual artistic way of looking at things. What's interesting about Liang's approach to Chinese architectural history is that he was trying to combine those both. He was trying to fuse culture with a small c, cultural community way of looking at architectural change with a high art culture with a capital C way of looking at architectural change. That is, on the one hand, he saw Chinese architecture as belonging to a historical cultural tradition that was at its height during the Tang Dynasty. And that steadily deteriorated, he thought, so that by the Ming and Qing dynasties, it was decadent, and fortuitously it was replaced by international modern architecture in the 20th century. So here we have an organic story of birth, maturity, and change, a kind of implicit biological metaphor somewhere in culture, in society, in general, architecture changes. And it's worth noting that one of the first major exhibitions of this kind of high Chinese architecture in the United States 20 years ago was called Chinese traditional architecture. But Liang also wanted the Dafodian to be emblematic of a high culture, a universal culture. And so that's why he equated the Chinese order with the elements of classical architecture that had been enshrined beginning in the Renaissance, but even more in the 18th and 19th centuries, enshrined as the pinnacle of Western culture. So this kind of Chinese architecture we found in the Dafodian was for Liang the equivalent of the Greek, the temples of ancient Greece or Rome. And he wanted that to be a high art, a formal tradition akin to those of self-conscious Western artistic schools. And that formal tradition he found in the canons of the official manual Yingzhao Fashi, as embodied in the major buildings of imperial China. So by looking at these major buildings, by assuming that they all in some way were related to that manual, he was arguing that China had an aesthetic tradition, a high aesthetic tradition equivalent to that of the West. So that for him then, the evolution of Chinese architecture explained as a result of the allegiance of an architectural intelligentsia to a normative document that everyone paid some sort of obeisance to. Another important point about the fieldwork tradition in which the Society for Research in Chinese Architecture worked. By the early 19th century, European field workers had turned their attention from the monumental architecture of antiquity to the monumental architecture of their own Northern European and later American homelands. And by the late 19th century, they had shifted their gaze from the monumental to the more ordinary, to what we would now call vernacular architecture. So in the early 19th century, French and German and English architectural historians and architects began to look, for instance, at the Gothic. And they all found that the Gothic had originated in their own countries. That is, these two changes come from two related projects. One was a critique of contemporary architecture by appealing to the superior architecture of the past. Those people in the past, the wisdom of the ancestors. The ancestors knew and practiced architecture that was better, that was more honest, whatever, than our own. So there's a kind of primitivism about it, whether we're looking at the oldest houses in Connecticut, or whether we're looking at Gothic buildings in England. So that's one reason for this emphasis on craftsmanship and structure that we see Liang inheriting. But the other, which is at least as important, is a nationalistic project, an attempt to find an architecture that is particular to or characteristic of one's own society, or what one imagines one's own society to be. As Vimalin has pointed out, much of Liang Sicheng's work was meant to support the nationalistic goals he inherited from his father, the historian and reformer Liang Qichao. There's a growing body of scholarship that shows how deeply architectural history, architectural historiography, since the second half of the 19th century, since the beginning of the 19th century, has been permeated globally by such political and cultural nationalism. As one example, there's a French series published in the 1970s and 80s called L'Architecture Rurale Française. It's a 22-volume survey that went department by department. It was created by the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique. And according to Gwyn Marion Jones, an English scholar who reviewed these books, in this project, the editors consciously suppressed locally distinctive building types in favor of those that would give an impression over the course of the series of a kind of cultural unity existing within the boundaries of modern France today. So local peculiarities would undermine that idea. So we only show buildings that look like buildings in other parts of France. The research that Liang Sicheng and his colleagues in the society undertook fell into that category by focusing on officially sponsored or so-called high architecture. They strove to create an image of national cultural unity in modern China. To sum up so far what we've been seeing in terms of what Liang missed or perhaps didn't think worth looking at, his architectural history was a positivist architectural history. It concentrated on the physical. It was concerned with studying change over time in the context of a high tradition defined by a normative document, the Yingzhao Fashe, and that has as its underlying agenda the provision of visual or material proof of a unified cultural nation, China within its modern boundaries. So what didn't Liang Sicheng and his colleagues see? Once we move away from form and craftsmanship and we begin to talk about things such as culture and nationhood, then we're moving from the object itself to its makers and users. One of the contributions of vernacular architecture studies in recent decades has been to ask those kinds of questions, to study how buildings have changed as a way of asking how society, how people's lives have changed. To be concerned less with formal typologies or craft traditions, although people still look at these as ways of understanding the kind of connoisseurship you need to understand a document, whether something written or something built, to understand it critically. But they're more interested in patterns of use, in categories of life that buildings can be expected, that buildings were expected to accommodate. So, but like the formal approach, the social approach has been used to distinguish in a summary manner a high kind of architecture versus a low or so-called vernacular architecture. Typically, one depicted as the architecture of the elite, the other as the architecture of the masses. One depicted as the architecture of international or national standards, the other of local patterns, just as in the formal approach. So that, like the formal approach that Liang and Liang belonged to, this social approach is based on distinctions, on boundaries, on borders, on differences. There is a kind of exoticism underlying it. We try to exaggerate the differences between the two and find the most exotic kinds of manifestations of what we're looking for. But there are two aspects of this approach that I think could lead us in a different direction. One is that spatial patterns now seem more important than formal qualities. That is, it's not what the spaces or structures are represented, but how you get from one to the other. This is an image from a very important book by Bill Hillier and Julianne Hansen that gives you a way of analyzing buildings in terms not of the specific spaces that are there, but of how you move from one to the other, so that three similar kinds of buildings on the top have three different spatial qualities, three different qualities of movement. So if how you get from one to another is important, that kind of spatial analysis transcends even the boundaries of individual buildings. So here are an image of a farmstead in New England in the northeast of the United States, an image of a compound, local compound in Uganda, in which the spatial structure it connects both inside and outside of buildings, connects buildings, separate buildings, and so on. So that the spatial structure, the pattern of use transcends the focus on the individual object that the formal approach argues for. The second is, as these two images imply, that this kind of spatial pattern, spatial analysis, organizes every building. And sometimes common patterns of order can connect very different buildings that cross our own imagined boundaries between so-called vernacular and so-called high-style architecture, between pre-industrial and industrial, or local or regional architecture and national architecture. So these kinds of questions can be asked about any building, from a palace to the smallest hovel. This is an analysis by an architect named Rene Chow, who studied suburban houses in this happens to be in Levittown, one of probably the most famous post-World War II suburb in the United States, where she's analyzing both on the left patterns of claiming, so that the darker areas are patterns that we think of, that the residents think of as belonging exclusively to them. The lighter areas are the areas that seem to be ambiguous. They're kind of semi-public, semi-private spaces, and the image on the right shows you patterns of access. And Chow has gone on to look at ways that immigrants from various parts of the world living in these standardized houses use them. So this is what I mean by the vernacular being an elusive concept. What is vernacular architecture? Is it a useful category? Is the vernacular a set of questions rather than a particular kind of building? The problem with all these approaches is, and the reason that I find the word vernacular useful only as a shorthand rather than as an analytical concept, is that whether we're speaking in terms of craft, whether we're speaking in terms of culture, of official dicta, of social patterns, of social class, of economic differential, of aesthetic canons, we endeavor to define architecture as a system and usually a closed system of relationships. On the left, the image from the typological theories of Durand, the late 18th, early 19th century French theorist, and on the right, a similar kind of categorization by Henry Glassy, the folklorist. And by seeing things as these kinds of systems, we are prevented from seeing or understanding the multiplicity of connections that cross the boundaries of our preferred systems. So that architecture is not only not a closed system, but I think it's open to question whether architecture is a system at all in any but the most trivial senses. If it's not a system, it's hard to accord it a unified, authentic identity that underpins the rhetorics of tradition, whether artistic or cultural, high or vernacular. A phrase that I find very useful in thinking about such things is circles of knowledge. And I'm embarrassed to show you these crude diagrams in a school of architecture, but these are at the outer edges of my computer skills. Any building lies at the intersection of a varying number of partially overlapping but not identical circles of knowledge. It may have to do with the intersection between professional and artisanal struggles for position, spatial patterns of social interaction, formal vocabularies, or we could look at intersections of craft practices, availability and expense of materials, new ideas derived from publications or from other sources. We could, I've messed up my order here again. We could look at it as an intersection of social rivalries, professional rivalries, social hierarchies, arcane ideas. But in any case, the building always, any building is at the intersection of a number of these bodies of knowledge that are not the same as one another, but that overlap in the particular building. So let me give you an example of what I mean. This is Monticello, which was perhaps the most famous house in America. It was initially preserved for nationalistic reasons because it was the home of Thomas Jefferson, who was an important leader in the Revolution, who was the principal author of the Declaration of Independence, who was the third president of the United States. Later on, it became known as, seen as a monument of high architecture, as one of the great monuments of architecture in the United States. And there's no doubt that Jefferson wanted to think of himself as part of the high architectural discourse of the Renaissance. He was very fond of the works of Andrea Palladio, of the work and writings of English Palladian architects. Later, after he went to France in the 1780s, he acquired a similar fondness for French Renaissance architecture and neoclassical architecture. And all of these things he drew on very unsystematically in creating his house. He worked and reworked this house constantly. He first began it in 1770 as a much different house. He worked on it for a while. He got tired of it. The Revolution and other things intervened. He came back to it in 1797. He worked on it on and off until 1811. When he stopped, it was still incomplete. He finally ran out of energy. If we look at this house spatially, we see a plan that is based in part on English Palladian mansions with a hall saloon suite. That is, you come into a big impressive hall and you move behind it to the kind of major social room. But part of it also, as he remodeled it, is based on French suite planning in kinds of houses that he had seen in Paris when he was there in the 1780s, and particularly the Hôtel de Salm, which was being built at the time he was there. Now these kinds of houses, these planning devices, are meant to accommodate two very different kinds of elite social interaction. But here they're combined in one house. And the whole house, in turn, is organized on spatial principles that are developed in part from English building, the kind of horizontal planning with most public, most work at one end and most private at the other end. They're used in English houses from the smallest to the largest, from the Middle Ages on, adding vertical circulation after the early modern period, so that the lower you go, the more work-a-day it is, the higher you go, the more private it is. All of these things crammed together in one house. If we ask about how it's made, here the house is using technologies that belong to the English and Anglo-American craft tradition known at all levels. In Virginia, brick was the preferred building material of the elite. And brick laid in Flemish bond, which you see here in Monticello on the right, and in an orangerie of another house of the same era on the left. This was seen as the most luxurious kind of brickwork at the time Monticello was built. So he has ideas from English mansions, he has ideas from French mansions, he has ideas from the what we might call Anglo-American tradition. He has the craft comes from a craft tradition that transcends any of those particular circles of knowledge. But all these things, the brickwork and the Flemish bond, connect Jefferson also to his small community, to the skills of the workmen who were available, and to the preferences of his social peers among the slave-holding elite. But also the relationship of Jefferson and his family spaces to the spaces in which his slaves lived and worked is also a highly personalized version of the ways domestic space was organized by other slaveholders in late 18th century Virginia. So it's misleading to place Monticello in a particular tradition, to categorize it as vernacular or high. It's a prototypical example of the kinds of intersections that I illustrated with my crude Venn diagrams. And that could be mapped for any building of any size in any place. And that has two potential implications for our understanding of architectural change. And the first is fluidity. Buildings and groups of buildings are moving targets. They're hard to pin down chronologically, socially, geographically, culturally. The second is decenteredness, and I evoke that overused word to mean that we can't think of architectural traditions as having birthplaces or centers. The whole old idea of cultural hearths and so on, whether they be rural or metropolitan, this diffusionist model, long rejected or severely qualified by anthropologists and archaeologists. Each place is its own center. So that rather than there being 4 or 5 or however many you want to say cultures within architecture has been developed, the center is constantly moving around the human cultural surface of the earth. Wherever you are is the center of that particular architectural tradition. A better way to think about architecture, I think, is in terms that I used at the beginning, ordinariness and extraordinariness. I can't say it. In any given setting, certain kinds of buildings are extraordinary in that context. And that has nothing to do with size, with monumentality, with official importance. Those extraordinary buildings could be especially old. They could be especially odd. They could be idiosyncratic. They could be a form rarely seen in that area. They're extraordinary in terms of local meanings and relationships and significance. They're extraordinary in that they force us to alter our common patterns of use of space. There's no such thing then as vernacular architecture, although there are circles of knowledge, whether they be craft, social, visual, that are more or less geographically or chronologically constricted, but their use in particular buildings is always mixed. So I'm arguing that the history of architecture is not a history of high and low or formal and vernacular, but a history of webs and flows rather than discrete categories or linear chains of cause and effect, so that everything is in play, nothing is determined or determining. It's a history that's unfolding in a simultaneously intersecting, unbounded, nonlinear way, rather than the rise and fall of particular threats. So, to conclude, Nancy Steinhardt and others argued in Vimelin and Dayan's book that even after he knew about the Nanshan-si main hall and knew it was older than Dafodian, Liang continued to stress the primacy of the building at Foguang-si, because Nanshan-si did not epitomize his understanding of the Chinese architectural tradition in the Tang era. It wasn't the highest or best example. And it gives us a way to return to our original question, and that is, what did Liang Sicheng and the Society for Research in Chinese Architecture miss at Mount Wutai, and why? And the answer is they missed those webs. They missed those connections. They came looking for singular examples of which were the oldest possible, the most officially important, examples that adhered to a singular, all-embracing structural or design canon. They came searching for the extraordinary without realizing that it's inseparable from the ordinary. Thank you.